Good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here for the third Golden Key System Leadership webinar on the topic of gender and multiple disadvantage. Just a couple of housekeeping information for you all. So people are welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat box. We're really interested to hear sort of where you're based, what your interests are, and possibly what your role is if you're working or maybe volunteering. There'll be some slides during the webinar that the panelists have prepared, and these will all be shared with everyone after the session. This webinar is also going to be recorded, so that will also be shared with you. Throughout the session, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions after the panelists have spoken. So please put questions in the Q&A box. And sort of throughout the session, we'll be able to keep a check on that and also relay them to the panelists. But you'll also have an opportunity to upvote any particularly interesting ones that you're really keen to get answered. So for anyone who's new to Golden Key is a partnership between statutory services in Bristol, commissioners, the voluntary sector, and people with lived experience all across the city. And we work together to improve services for Bristol citizens with the most complex needs. My name's Tabby, and I work for Golden Key as part of the service coordinator team. And I'm seconded to that team by 125, which is a Bristol-based project that supports women who experience multiple disadvantage. Our work at Golden Key is all overseen by a partnership board, which is made up of a network of our partner agencies across the city. And the data collected by the Golden Key team shows over time that the project's been in place that women actually experience severe and multiple disadvantage quite differently to men. And so the board was quite interested in this and commissioned a report to explore why women's experiences of severe and multiple disadvantage differ so greatly, and to understand how services and the system in Bristol can better respond to the needs of women. So we published our report on International Women's Day this year, so just a few weeks ago, and so we'll be discussing the findings today. We have three fantastic panelists who are all incredibly knowledgeable with lots of experience, and I'm really excited for you all to hear from them and their views on what the report means for women who experience multiple disadvantage and how we can work to maybe implement to improve some of the systems that they face. And just to say that if there's any terminology that we use that maybe isn't that clear, please feel free just to sort of pop it in the chat box, and we'd be happy to clarify any of those points for you. So I'll introduce the panelists. First up, we've got Beth Foraker, who is a research officer for Golden Key, part of our learning team, and Beth was one of the Women's Report's co-authors. We also have Rosie Ohagan, who's Assistant Chief Probation Officer for Bristol, Gloucestershire, and Gloucestershire, Somerset and Wiltshire Probation Services. Rosie's active both locally and nationally and works to address issues that lead women into offending. And she also works on developing pathways that will support them to turn their lives around. And we also have Anna Smith, who's the CEO of 125 and an instrumental person actually in getting this report commissioned. And Anna's really passionate about supporting women in achieving their goals and redressing some of the inequalities they face in society. And Anna's committed to putting women at the heart of services. So without further ado, Beth, can I please invite you to speak?
Yes.
Thank you.
Tabby. I am just going to share my screen with everybody. So let me just sort that out first. Hang on a second. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so yeah, as Tabby says, I'm Beth Foraker and a research officer with the learning team at Golden Key, and I've been involved with various aspects of the development of this report. And so I just wanted to share a bit of background. Tabby's mentioned some of the background already, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about how the report came about, and then give a brief overview of the recommendations before handing on to our other panelists. So first of all, to talk about the background, how it came about. We'd been drawing out overviews of outcomes data from the Golden Key Service Coordinator team for the Golden Key Partnership Board, which this was happening in about the summer of 2019. And part of that process meant that we started looking at our NDT outcomes, and the NDT, the New Directions Team tool, is a tool for assessing kind of complexity of need. And so it was one of the outcomes measurements we were looking at. And we were looking at that in relation to time spent with clients. And we were noticing that the team spent a lot more time at the beginning with clients. And then the longer that somebody was with the program, the less contact time there was with their service coordinator. But their NDT scores continued to reduce and improve, which was really great. And we felt like it was showing that investing in that initial time was really paying off, and clients were still continuing to have positive NDT scores. And we could have just left it there and feed that back to the partnership board. But then we started breaking down the data by gender, and we saw that the story was overwhelmingly positive for men, but it was really, the men's scores were really skewing the overall scores. And even though women were about 47% of the caseload, the difference between genders was really quite dramatic and quite stark. So we started wondering why that was, and the partnership board asked us to kind of look at that in more depth, which is what led to the report. I guess looked at separately, it was really obvious that women's outcomes were less positive at that point. And just to kind of reflect on that, the bigger picture can quite easily cloud the specific experiences of clients with particular characteristics or situations. It kind of brings up a broader issue around data and kind of how we observe data and how easily it would have been to not notice this as an issue. We could have celebrated the overall positives without noticing this underlying problem. So at the same time as these conversations were going on in the partnership board, various other data was emerging in places which was highlighting this issue more widely. And I'm sure some of you will be aware of the Lankelly Chase Gender Matters report, which was released about the time we were starting to talk about this. And that also highlighted biases in data that can particularly impact on women. When you start to look at different aspects, in fact, the Gender Matters report, I think, reflected on the hard edges, which had come out prior to that, talking about how the different ways that we define multiple disadvantage can really hide women's experiences. So we need to be careful about our definitions as well as our data kind of analysis. And at the same time, National Lottery, the Fulfilling Lives evaluation was producing information that was really showing that other fulfilling lives across the country, other programs have noticed that, that these experiences for women were very different. So there was this kind of variety of local and national learning all emerging at the same time over the last year or two. And over the time that we were starting to put the report together. And we kind of, we knew this already, and everyone is aware that women's experiences are different, but it was interesting that people have started to talk about it and really put things together. So yeah, where are we up to? So I'll talk a little bit about how the report developed. Initially, we looked at gathering a kind of overview of the current situation, both mainly nationally, but we did a kind of brief literature review, and then we carried out a staff survey, which some of you might have seen or been part of, to gather more insight into the local perspective. And this was challenging because it was right at the start of the pandemic and people had quite limited time and resources. And we would have also liked to have run more focus groups with staff from services and things like that. But we were really keen to do what we could within the kind of limitations of the situation because we wanted to keep the conversation moving. And our aspiration, I guess, is to share our observations and our learning and to start some conversations, which is, or to take part in some conversations as well, which is hopefully what we're doing today and why we're all here. So after the survey and some analysis, we also held a workshop with some of the service coordinators at Golden Key who had been involved in the original data collection. And that was that really helped to reflect on the report and to identify things that might have been missing, and also to kind of put in Golden Key's service coordinator team's perspective into how they have been approaching things. So that gives you an idea of the kind of process that we went through, and now I'd like to turn to the recommendations and just talk through them one at a time very briefly before I hand over to the next panelist. Okay, so there's 7 recommendations that we make in the report in total. And the first is that we recommend a system-wide commitment to integrating a gender and trauma-informed approach, with staff wellbeing as a clear priority within that. And then secondly, having a gendered approach to commissioning, we would really like to consider broader definitions of severe and multiple disadvantage, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that women's experiences are visible and talked about and planned in services. And then to have an open approach to co-production, so involving women with lived experience and with a range of identities in the design of services and interventions feels really important. And the 4th recommendation is looking at an intersectional understanding of the needs of women facing severe and multiple disadvantage. And we feel that more targeted research could be done in this area into experiences of specific groups of women. And we also we would like to recognise the knowledge that already exists and kind of invest in existing specialist and local services. And then having a commitment to creating more women-only spaces across services. So exploring ways in which we can all provide accessible women's-only spaces and services, including within wider mixed gender environments. And some women we found have engaged more with certain services during COVID-19. So also, as a kind of side note, it would be interesting to explore and look at the reasons for that, and in order to kind of help maintain things that might have happened and to increase that accessibility going forward. And then drawing on specialist knowledge and existing best practice to develop a deeper understanding of the needs and experiences of transgender, non-binary and non-conforming people who are facing severe and multiple disadvantage. And then our last recommendation is about ensuring that women's organisations are represented at all levels, by ensuring that women's services are involved at every level and up to a strategic level when discussing provision for people with multiple disadvantage across the city and further afield. So we're really keen for this to be the start of a conversation, and we look forward to hearing from individuals and organisations from across the city about ways in which the report might have resonated with you, things that you feel like we haven't looked at yet or have been missed out, or thoughts about how you or your organisation may plan to use this learning or expand on this learning and share your experiences further. So I think that's everything that I want to say for now as a kind of overview of the report and how we got to this point. So Tavi, I'm going to hand back to you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much for that.
That is okay.
And Rosie, can I invite you?
Thank you very much, Tavi. And I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to talk today and to respond to this really, really valuable report. I found it incredibly interesting and very much needed, and to really support some of the work that's been going on. So my name is Rosie Ohagan. I'm Assistant Chief Probation Officer of the South West CRCs. I'm Head of Interventions, but I'm also been the Women's Lead across the South West. And just a little bit about me, I trained as probation officer 36 years ago, so I've been around the service for quite a while, and I've always been passionate as a practitioner and as a manager and a strategic manager about the work of women's, our work with women and to improve outcomes for women. Next slide, please. So in terms of probation services, cases of women have always been identified as complex and challenging, and this is echoed in the report that those are terms that are often used to describe the women that we're working with. Women managed by probation are likely to be struggling with multiple issues, as we know: homelessness, mental health, substance misuse, relationships difficulties, and many more. And also we know that women are likely to present with severe trauma, which has been in their past, due to various levels of abuse. But also, quite importantly, while we're managing women, they're still living through that abuse, and they're dealing with a number of other issues directly resulting from it. And that has a big impact on how women engage with the services, engage with compliance, and that in itself leads on to other difficulties. Next slide, please. So just looking back on where our journey has been with women. So back in 2007, Baroness Corston was commissioned to prepare a report on women. And this highlighted the failings in the criminal justice system to meet the specific needs of women. The criminal justice system, the probation service, was designed around male offending and meeting the needs of males. But there was a failure to recognise that women's journey into offending was very different. The reasons around it, and therefore the journey out of it, needed to be different as well. And that also went for the interventions and the treatments as well. So the call was for a more holistic, women-centred approach, and also the system, which would help women to develop resilience, develop life skills, emotional literacy, and successfully move on with their lives. Next slide, please. So jumping forward, it's a few years in between, and since then we've also had Transforming Rehabilitation, which I'll refer to a little bit more, but just to say for colleagues who may not be familiar what that was about. So in 2014, the probation service was split into National Probation Service, which worked predominantly with high risk of harm offenders, and the CRCs, community rehabilitation companies, which were commissioned to work with the lower risk offenders. And that's where most of the women were managed within the CRCs. There was a time of disarray and settling down, but also things moved ahead a bit in September 2018, when, in partner with the MOJ, HMPPS, they developed and published 3 key policy documents, which were very significant in informing the work of probation at a strategic level, at a higher level. We've up until then had lots of very committed staff who were working locally, but it was really important that we had some strategic input. So the Female Offender Strategy, which was published in 2018, Women's Policy Framework, and also guidance on working with women in custody and the community, which was aimed at looking at multiple and complex needs of women who've encountered the criminal justice system or at risk of doing so. We also had the Farmer Review in 2019, which looked at strengthening prisoners' family ties and looked at women through the lens of family and other relational ties. And we know that women experience additional trauma from being apart from their families, but we also know that the families are very key in supporting women out of offending and keeping them safely in the community. Next slide, please. So let's look at what we've done within probation, what's happened with this over the last few years. So a national women's team was established, and within the CRCs and National Probation Service, women's lead roles were set up. So those were senior leaders, and that was one of the groups that I was actually have been involved in. So that national women's team has not only been looking at implementing the strategies identified in the last slide, but also looking at what innovation, what good practice, what are we doing on the ground that could be used and implemented and learned from. We've been looking at cascading learning, so that's sharing learning across the CRCs and the National Probation Service. We've established women champions. That's been one of the things that in each area there are probation staff who identify as women's champions. They are staff who hold more of the cases, but also they're keen to learn and to support other colleagues working with women. Training in gender-informed practice and trauma-informed approaches have been very key in the last 5 or 6 years, and it's been recognised it's important for our staff to have that training. It's been piecemeal because obviously the CRCs are all different organisations, but I can say locally that in Bristol and the Southwest, we've actually prioritised as many people as possible getting trained in that, but even if they haven't had the specific training, they actually have got access to tools and to information. With the CRCs, we had supply chain partnerships where we were able to commission women's specialist organisations. And that was so important because that meant that what we didn't have in-house, we could purchase in, we could use what was in the community. And many of those organisations had women's centres. And what we know is having a safe place for women and the additional holistic support that women can receive within women's centres was really important to their rehabilitation. In Bristol, up until November 2020, we've had Eden House, which some of you may be familiar with. I'll move on to what's happened with Eden House a bit further on, but you know, that's been very critical, and having that space for women to be a safe women-only space. And the other thing that's been happening is collaborative working across gender responsive pathways. So a little bit more about that. That's actually working together with colleagues in public health, DWP, with prisons, and with the voluntary sector and many more in looking at more strategic working across. And we've had a gender responsive pathway group that's been established for the last 3 or 4 years. And it's been really important in bringing all our services together and looking at how we work with those women, because those women touch all our services, and how we can improve what we're delivering. Next slide, please. So with the National Women's Team, just going back to them a bit, we're now in this situation with probation unification. So having had separate CRC and MPS for the since 2014, we're actually going to have a unified probation model, which followed the probation reform programme. So the Women's National Team have been very involved in the design of those services. And that's been very critical because it's ensured that all aspects of the reform programme consider gender-informed, trauma-informed, and where possible, trauma-responsive practice across the work streams. So the specifications for the services under the dynamic framework have all been influenced by that team and what we know and what we've learned. And we've also got specific women's services that have been commissioned. Next slide, please. So the developments, as I mentioned, the probation reform programme, the unification. So we'll see one probation service, one group of staff working with women, and that sharing and unified approach. We've got commissioned rehabilitative services for women in Bristol. So I understand that the award has been given but not yet announced, and we're very excited because we'll have a dedicated and secure commission service, which is for a 5-year commissioning cycle. We've also got a new approved premise in Bristol, which is Eden House. So Eden House, which had been at the Women's Centre, has now been is now going to be an approved premise. So it's going to be a 26-bed accommodation for women. It'll not just have women in Bristol, it will also be women in the southwest, but that's really, really important and really valuable for women coming out of prison, that there's a safe place for them to go, and particularly those women who are high risk of offending, who struggle to adjust to the community, to have it somewhere to be for 3 months at least as a minimum, as they progress on their journey out. And also in Bristol, we're going to have a new activity hub, and that's been set up by CTEC. So it's under some European funding and Ministry of Justice funding. So that focus is really about employability and employment skills, but the priority groups under that funding will include women, people from minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, people with health conditions, and those over 50s. Next slide, please. So there are some developments, and I think it's a positive looking picture going forward. The last year, the challenges we've had from managing women during COVID, we've learned a lot from that as well, and that's really important and part of our design and how we manage people going forward. So what we have found out, what we know, women like the flexibility of remote forms of supervision. We had significant engagement from women when we moved to telephone contact, which was very significant. As we know, women who've been in coercive controlling relationships or having anxiety, mental health issues, and may have not got to appointments to engage, have been able to use that, and we've been able to engage more effectively with them there. Many women also value the opportunity to go somewhere where they can meet somebody in person. We've got lots of good examples across the piece where people have been creative in actually enabling that. Going forward, we feel a blended approach, which will be sometime in the office, sometimes in other centres, and contact over the phone will actually support women and take account of their specific circumstances and help with their engagement. But we also know, as we've always known, the relationship with the offender manager is key, and that's very important in the design of our services, that we have consistent individuals who are working with service users and are not moved and transferred. Thank you. Next slide, please. So moving forward, I think what we've learned from the last number of years and what we know from this research, in other words, is the importance of collaborative working. No one organisation can actually do this work on their own. There's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge, and there's a lot of support out there. We need to ensure as a probation service that we're collaborating with our partners. We also need to understand better the needs of transgender, non-binary and gender non-conforming people in the criminal justice system. I don't think we know enough there, and I think we need to look to our partners to support us with that and how we can improve our services to them as we have done to all the elements of people who we manage. Understanding the needs of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller women, both in prison and in the community. And the other element is supporting staff, which is also referenced in the report, supporting staff who work with women who experience FSMD and all our challenges in relation to women. Because what we have is we get staff who burn out, and we need to ensure that our staff are absolutely able to keep that working and pass on their expertise and share others coming through, and we spread it around so that more people build that expertise. And we want to build an expertise and links with the local community organisation to increase partnership working. As I said, that's where people have built up a lot of expertise and trust with our service user group, and we want to build that. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, just to signpost you to a couple of other documents and things that are worth reading. In January 21, a concordant on women in the criminal justice system was published. So it establishes a whole system approach for women in or at risk of contact with the CJS. That's very key because within that's a commitment at the highest level of the system for all departments to work together, which is health, DWP, to identify the specific needs of women, to support trauma-informed training, to look at data collection, to look at outcomes. And we also want to look at the judiciary and sentencers because they're very key in looking at how we support women to remain out of custody and live better lives. A couple of papers. There's been an inquiry into the health of women in prisons, which is interesting to read. And also in March, there's been a paper on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller women in prison. And within our own organisation, Dr. Kerry Devitt, who's a researcher with KSS CRC, which is linked to our parent company, has done some research in resilience, wellbeing and sustainability of our staff, our women leads. And that's quite a short piece of research, but it's actually really interesting and looking at how we support our staff and how we ensure that they don't burn out and we can actually grow and develop the skills. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And really great to see all that recommended reading. That's brilliant. If I could please invite Anna as our last speaker on the panel today.
Morning, everyone. Thank you to the previous speakers, and great to see you, Tabby, and lots of other people who I know in this Zoom and some who don't know our work so well. I'm going to echo some of the things that others have said in a slightly different way, I hope, but I'm not going to apologise for that because I don't think this has been said enough until now, and it needs to be keep being said. So I'm Anna Smith, I'm the CEO of 125. Thank you for asking me to speak and share my thoughts and the organisation's resonance around this really interesting report. 125 works with street sex workers in Bristol. We've been around for 25 years. And in the last 4 years, we've expanded our services to include women who are at risk of street sex work, women who are vulnerable in some way, women who have had 2 or more children permanently removed into care, and women who are moving away from street sex work. They are an incredibly difficult group to measure, in the sense that they often don't want to come back and say thank you at the time they're at, because the time that they've been with us has been a difficult one for them. They disappear off our radar for the wrong reasons, and some for the right reasons, and maybe we hear from them 10 years later. So this report brings together some thinking that we've been having, but and measures it in a way that we haven't been able to. So it's brilliant, and I think that we can learn a great deal from it. So next slide, please. You've asked me to speak about why does a gendered approach matter? What are the challenges that we face, and how do we embed the report's learning? So 125's women, about 250 women a year we work with, have all experienced domestic and sexual violence at some stage in their lives. Many are still experiencing it. They have issues with mental health. They are often in active addiction to help them deal with the trauma they've experienced. They may well be involved in the criminal justice system. They may well have housing issues, including being homeless, street homeless. They have one or more of those issues, but they have all in common experienced trauma. And I think it's from that point of view that this report is so useful, because that trauma is something that women do experience differently. And I'll go on to talk a bit more about why that is, and how reliving that trauma and not dealing with that trauma means we can't support them in the way that we would like to heal. Next slide, please. So why does a gender approach matter? I'm not going to suggest for a moment that the things that are experienced here are experienced any less by men, and that they feel any less traumatized by it, but these are often issues that are disproportionately experienced by women. And also there's some things embedded in our culture around expectations of women and sexuality that I think feed into their trauma and their guilt and their shame, which feeds into, of course, their self-worth. So sexual violence is experienced disproportionately by women. Last year in the UK, only 98.5% of rapes, 90.5 went unprosecuted. And what that means, I think, is that women don't feel heard, they don't feel believed, and they don't feel validated for a deeply traumatic experience. Domestic abuse is much more prevalent for women. In lockdown, it's risen by 1/3 in Bristol, and so has sexual violence. Violence of a sexual nature being reported to 125 has increased by 25% in the last few months. And again, these are all deeply traumatic experiences and hidden from the world. Women's housing, you may not see women sleeping rough. They're often sleeping rough with a group of men for protection, but they may be in deeply inappropriate housing. They may be exchanging sex for housing. So, you know, that fundamental need to be housed safely is not going on for them either. Within the permanent removal of children, and obviously this affects fathers too, women are having a deeper level of trauma because they're involved in every single removal of a child, whereas what seems to happen with the fathers is that they disappear and are not involved in those continual removals. So that is felt more keenly, and men report less impact of the trauma of that removal. And I think that feeds into feelings about motherhood and a lot of judging that goes on around what a mother should be, when we're not even asking often where the father is. And we just had Mother's Day, and we did a lot of work with the women around their feelings around that. Women are disproportionately affected by poverty and financially controlled in abusive relationships. Women who street sex work are quite often street sex working to support a partner's habit, or shoplifting to support a partner as well. And again, things that Rosie have said will resonate with that. So I think some of the trauma is around the cultural perceptions of women as mothers sexually, and how they feel about themselves with their street sex working or exchanging sex for a house over their head. Next slide, please. So the challenge that we face, I think, is around acknowledging those issues. This is not a gendered world. It hasn't been designed for women. And somebody disclosed to me recently that his sister, who is sadly no longer with us, had the same experiences as him. But he believes that the reason that she didn't make it through life in the way that he has is because the services weren't set up right for her. And whilst that's a really negative example, I think it's very true of some of the things that we see really going on in the world. I'm also going to talk about how we can move forward from that. So, and I also want, just before I forget, to recommend this amazing book, which is by Caroline Credas Perez, called Invisible Women, which, if you haven't heard of it or read it, just dip into it, because her very premise is about how data has been designed to measure the world for men, and I think that's what we're talking about really here. So one of the challenges that we face is housing women, as I've mentioned. So some of the work that we've done, which I think is hopeful, is Housing First puts a roof over someone's head despite their complex needs. And we have an example of working with Golden Key and Bristol City and housing associations around women who'd either not been housed safely for many, many years, or been in and out of the homeless pathway for many years, again because their needs weren't being met. And through some training and some work together, we were able to speak to the housing sector and help them understand some of their judgments and assumptions about being made by women who there might be lots of social unrest around because they're street sex working, there might be complaints around neighbours. And because of that understanding, we were able to then house women safely in accommodation, often for the first time, by explaining their needs and their trauma. I think that another challenge we face is that idea around domestic abuse of why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't he stop? Should be the question that we're asking. And the recent commission by the Mayor starts with the sentence, we will start with what's right for you. And I think that's where we need to start with a lot of domestic abuse services, in maybe not removing her from the home if we don't have to, and her children, but thinking about what's best for her. I think another challenge we face is that having separate services for men and women costs more. Having a one-size-fits-all service doesn't cost as much, but it probably doesn't work. It's probably not as cost effective. And we're talking about people with a number of complex needs. Within our Pause programme, we work with women who've had children removed for 18 months. And the team have reported that one of the things they feel is not being addressed within that time is domestic abuse, because leaving your partner, the father of your children, coming out of a very complex psychological situation takes a lot of time and bravery. So it's a long game, and we need to stay with the women that we're working with until such time as they can be independent. And I think we need to address some of the judgment that happens. There was a story in the Bristol Post about 4 weeks ago about one of our women, which was incredibly negative, judged her as a mother, judged her as an offender. At no point was there any mention about where the father of the children were. And there were some really horrible comments under that post which affected her deeply. And that idea that someone's choosing to be at risk of exploitation when actually they're in a position of very, very few choices quite often. And we need to understand that better and talk about that. Next slide, please. So how do we embed the recommendations? I've just got some suggestions. They're brilliant recommendations and they're wide ranging. I come back to a quote from somebody that we worked with a long time ago, who had really come along and dealt with many of the issues she had. She was clean, she was housed, she was pretty happy, but she said to me, I still haven't dealt with the trauma. And I think if we don't start with trauma-informed services, we can't really help people to heal, because that's where they need to start. They need that basis to be better. You may be aware that there could be a large chunk of funding coming into Bristol. Bristol's got through the first stage of Changing Futures, which is all about working with people with complex needs, and is putting in a bid that will go in early May for the second stage. And those conversations have involved myself and other people in Bristol about trauma-informed services around domestic abuse, for example. So I think that's where we need to start, with having those conversations with everybody, as Beth said, having women in the frame talking about women's services. The Lottery and Women and Girls Fund has a network in the South West that I've been very pleased to be a part of, and we held a conference last year. Would have been physical, but it was virtual, and we hope to hold more conferences to influence commissioners about the lack of funding coming into women's services, and about the need for trauma-informed services for women and intersectional services that meet women's needs. I think we all need to learn from each other. We're a very specialist service. I talked about how we've been working with the housing sector, but there's loads, everyone can learn from each other about the people that we're hoping to help. And if we understand those people better, we're then able to work together in a pathway to support them to move between whatever services they need. And one of the recommendations is co-production. We're having conversations with the Nelson Trust about working together, about the Women's Centre that's opening, and those conversations are about trauma-informed services and starting with that understanding. I think we need to use the evidence of this report to spread it widely, to tell the narrative of the report and to influence those who don't know about it, because it has really important information in it. And probably most important of all, we need to hear women's voices. We need to hear what's working for them, what's not working for them, and continue to adapt our services as a result. And the last slide, please. So I wanted to end with one of those voices. This is actually a Women's Centre user in Cornwall. It's from the work I've been doing in the Southwest with the National Lottery. And it's about women-only safe spaces, which I'm a very strong believer in. We come together here, listen to each other, learn from each other and get strong. You learn you deserve better and have things to offer, that living can be more than just surviving. And I think that's what we all want really for the women, that we want them to have a proper life and not just survive day to day. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. I'm just going to jump into some questions because I see some people have popped some into the Q&A. So the first one up is possibly, well, maybe any of the panel, open to everyone, but is the trauma lens the most effective way to engage across a range of key stakeholders to ensure that the specific needs of gender or women is best accounted for, as this will often highlight the intensity of work gender differences might require? So I guess, yeah, just asking whether a trauma lens is the best one really to sort of view this through.
I feel like, Anna, you touched on this a bit in your presentation anyway. Do you want to respond to it a bit more?
Yeah, I really do. I think it's not just about the original trauma, so to speak, that somebody might have experienced, but just that their lives take such a turn, I think, at that point. I mean, I think, you know, being sexually abused as a child means that your world changes, your perception of your world changes, the people around you aren't safe to be with, your home possibly isn't safe. And then often that goes on for more trauma to happen. So you start using drugs to mask that trauma, living a life where you don't feel good about yourself. So I do think it's the way to go and the way to start and to understand that. And it's, I know to the outside world, it possibly sounds very woolly, but I think it's we need to educate the outside world more, perhaps.
I'd just like to add to that as well. And I think, you know, I think the other important thing, particularly in looking at probation services and engagement with the criminal justice system, is women are continuing to live in the trauma. It's not past trauma, it's their current experiences. And that significantly impacts on how they behave and engage. And some of that behavior may not be considered as appropriate. And I think it's really important that we learn to understand why people are behaving in particular ways, and actually our responses adjust to understand and support that and enable them to move forward. So I do think it is that.
I guess I'll just add a little bit as well. It just occurred to me that one of the things that came out in the report is kind of leading on from what you're saying, Rosie, about it being current, and that actually not having trauma-informed services can then compound those issues. Like I think one of the examples in the report was about women being invited only into mixed therapy groups, and that being problematic and kind of having the opposite to the support that they were looking to access, so compounding those things. Yeah.
Thank you. There's one here also from Alison, which is, what do you think is the appetite for gender-informed commissioning in Bristol, and where are the opportunities? possibly maybe Rosie, I think you were speaking a little bit more about commissioning, if you could.
Yes. So what I've been referred to as national commissioning. So some of the services as part of the unification, where we've got national commissioning of services so that it is filtered down. We've also got, we've got the regional, so we've got regional probation director who actually has funding and to look at what do each areas need, so it can be particularly tailored. So I think that's actually looking at what's there already, what do certain areas need. For example, in the southwest we've got lots of rurality, so so it's actually tailored to what is needed in each area. So I can talk from that side of probation side.
Yeah, I would add that I think there's appetite. There's a great deal more to do, but there's some free thinking in Bristol. It's a positive place to be in relation to newness. I think that domestic abuse commissioning illustrates that, and I think that the pandemic, for all that it's been terrible for many of our service users, has opened up a conversation about some of the issues I've been talking about that we need to keep going. And about looking again at services and how they work. I mean, everyone in was a great thing. We managed to do that. It wasn't perfect, but we need to learn from that. And Rosie talked about learning from some of the issues around the pandemic, and for us too, we feel there's more outreach for us to do. So yeah, it's the time to have this conversation.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Beth possibly a question just around how we measure outcomes, because we know that we traditionally measure outcomes, or the traditional way that we measure them don't really work as well for women. So how do you think we can measure outcomes differently?
That's a good question. And I think it's kind of going a little bit back to the Gender Matters report and their observations of that, because I think especially with people who are facing multiple disadvantage, having a really narrow view of what we're looking at to frame that is what's historically been missing women out of the picture. And if we're opening that up to look at things like interpersonal violence and different ways of looking at mental health and how kind of intersectionality is impacting on the whole cohort, then I think it'll give us a better picture of women's experiences. I don't know if Anna or Rosie wants to add to that at all.
I was just going to say that I think with our organisation we need to get better at our data collection and looking at our outcomes and how we measure that. I think our measures have been very much in probation around commencements, starts, finishing, getting people through orders. I think some of that qualitative stuff isn't there, and I think also our data could be smarter, and I think we could be pulling things in from other organisations and areas as well.
That's actually, it's a good point between the qualitative and the quantitative, isn't it? Because it's really important to have quant data, but some of the qualitative stuff that came out of this report is what makes it so rich and what conveys the message a lot more usefully. Yeah, I guess it's looking at data collection quite carefully, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question from Jane. Jane firstly says thank you to all the panelists. And that Anna picked up on women who face domestic abuse and sexual abuse, but this didn't come up much for some of the other speakers. So could anyone else, could some of the other panelists maybe offer any further insight into these two factors?
Yes, yes, certainly. I would say most of the women that we manage in probation services have experienced domestic abuse and sexual abuse, both of those, and they're currently living in that and living in the trauma. I think one of the things that is important for our staff to do, and what does happen, is to support women to disclose. And that does happen when trusting relationships are built, and we have good examples in the city, for example, during COVID, we've had Safer Wednesdays, which has been based in Bridewell, where the main probation team sits. And our women's specialist team have been there working with their colleagues in Missing Link, working with the police, and being able to support. There's examples of support women escaping really violent situations. So absolutely, you know, understanding and knowing that most of our women are involved in relationships that are coercive, controlling, and many will have experienced sexual abuse in the past as well, and will be currently. And I think it's important for us then that we refer and work with our partner agencies who've got that specialist knowledge and skill, and encourage women to access those services.
I guess,
Thank you.
can I add a little bit to that?
Yeah, please do, Beth. Yeah.
Our learning emerging from Golden Key, I mean, in this report, but also more widely in our Housing First project and in our kind of wider service coordinator experience, is that what Rosie mentioned about relationships and relationships with workers in relationships, but being able to kind of build a trusting relationship with a worker in order to address the other relationship dynamics in women's lives. And so from a commissioning point of view, building that time, especially early on, to just be able to build relationship with workers without necessarily having formal structures, and being quite flexible. I think Anna had talked in her presentation about the importance of the flexibility of approach. I can't remember, maybe it was you, Rosie, actually was saying that, about finding different ways for women to communicate with their support is really important, so that we can offer that support.
Brilliant, thank you. And Hazel's got a question, which is given that COVID-19 has significantly added to the detrimental impact of imprisonment on women's lives, sort of in terms of mental and psychological well-being in particular, is there anything that can be included in the re-nationalisation of probation services to meet or acknowledge this increase in need?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a good question, Hazel. There's a lot about the impact of mental health on women in custody. I think what I would say is the prison services themselves are actually doing a lot with trying to support the women that they're working with within those restrictions. And I think we've seen in our local prison, HMP Eastwood Park, where the governor and the head of reducing offending are very committed and very concerned about that. And one of the things that within the services that they actually use the partnership agencies that they have coming into the prisons. I think it's a challenge. I think we still have COVID. You know, one of the things would be fewer women go into custody. And I think that's really important, particularly for short sentences, which we all know are not particularly productive in terms of changing people's lives. There's some work goes on at the court, and I think that's the place we need to look at that, look at working with sentencers, looking at making sentences aware and understanding. We have in Bristol, we have an initiative with a partner organisation, Missing Link, working with staff in the courts to meet women as they come to the courts, gather information to support the probation staff writing pre-sentence reports, so that information about what alternatives are available in the community that's actually going to address the offending and support them. Those sorts of initiatives, I think, will actually start to see the outcome of some of that as we go further along with this service. The other thing as well, part of unification and the design has been to reintroduce pre-sentence reports, because we've moved from the full pre-sentence report to shorter on the day reports. I think by doing that, we missed a lot of information and being able to convey the complexity of women's circumstances and what might be more effective. in actually supporting them away from custody and keeping them safe and keeping the community safe. So I think that's work in progress, and certainly I think there's a big sort of move for fewer women to be going into custody from all our agencies.
Thank you, Rosie. Annie's responded just to Anna to say trauma-informed is not woolly. She agrees. And I was actually interested to think a little bit more about the perspective of people with lived experience. And possibly, Anna, if you wouldn't mind answering, what do you think agencies, not just in Bristol, but across the UK, should be doing to include the voices of women who've experienced some of the trauma that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, it's not easy. We struggle with it because a lot of the women that come to us after their first point of contact are chaotic and not more interested in perhaps having a sleep in a safe space or having some lunch than they are about answering a survey or talking about how they feel about something. But I think we have to find many different ways of doing it at many different points of women's interaction with services, accept that not all women want to do this. But for some it will be very empowering. So what we want to do is one of our 7 goals actually, is have a woman come on our board and be present for part of our board meetings, come to strategic meetings with us. Golden Key have been very good about making feedback from people with lived experience a part of every level of strategic work and operational work. So I think, you know, years and years ago, one of the nicest moments of my career was a woman turning to me after a MARAT meeting that she'd spoken at as a service user and said, "You've given me my voice back." And I think for some women it can be incredibly empowering and can lead to volunteering and peer mentoring and all of that. So we just have to put quite a lot of time into it and find out what works for us.
Thank you. And just to finish the rest of Annie's comments, it was just suggesting that room for reflective space for people after for people with lived experience is very important at sort of every level before and after, and their sort of continued involvement with services. So thank you, Annie. Maybe just got time for one quick question. Do you think? Yeah. Which probably to everyone, but do you know, can anyone share any sort of good examples of best practice or good practice across Bristol that's kind of happening at the moment? Possibly Rosie, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what we've got. Yeah, I think one of the things I will talk about is I mentioned the Safer Wednesdays, and I think that has come out of COVID. It's come out of Eden House closing because you know, due to COVID, and thinking about how can we reach our women, how can we reach them safely, how can we be there for them. And with Safer Wednesdays it's a woman's only time. We have our specialist workers there, that women come in and see their officers, and it is a safe time. And I think the other important thing is that when there's disclosure, when we know things are happening, that we're able to rally support from other organisations very, very quickly. And I think that would be something that I want to go forward with, that you know, that we have, we're able to get women out of situations quickly and safely. I think we're talking a lot more to our partners, and I think with caseloads coming down, with new services appearing, I think that's actually going to make a lot of difference in the future going forward for our working with women in a holistic way.
Brilliant. Well, I can only just thank everyone just so very much for joining us this morning, and also obviously to our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing all of your views. It's been really, really interesting to hear and a great way to start the morning. So I want to wish everyone a great rest of your day, and please do stay in touch with us. We're going to be sending out the slides and the webinar as well, which has been recorded if anyone wants to sort of watch it again. So thank you again, and hope to see you all soon.